Thank you, Ann. Our reading from the gospel today comes from the first chapter of John. We run smack into the beginning of the selection of the apostles and of the disciples who become apostles. And we run into Philip and his brother Nathaniel. And Nathaniel's a bit smart, but he's also a bit snarky. And so we'll see how both Philip and Jesus deal with that snarkiness. Hear the word of the Lord. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We found him, about whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph, from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, Come and see." Well, when Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, here is truly an Israelite in whom there's no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" And Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." And Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Well, Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You'll see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." May God grant understanding to this reading of God's holy word, the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Let us come to God in prayer. Almighty and merciful God, open our hearts, open our minds. Let us see you clearly. Let there be no deceit in our hearts or in the message we hear. Lord, help us to act and help us to respond as Nathanael did. Help us to come to the realization that you are indeed the Son of God. And not just the King of Israel, but the King of all of us. And it's your kingdom. And that we serve you, or at least we should. So, Lord, help us to hear that message. Help us to understand it. Help us to understand not to let what we think and the prejudices we have rule our life. Instead, help us to move past our prejudices, be open to you speaking to us, and help us to be open to each person to whom and with whom we encounter. Help us to see in them your call and to be able to discern what you want us to do. That's the message you want me to bring today, Lord, I think. I'll do my best. Open my heart, open my mind, speak to me, and then through me to your children. And may we all have our hearts and minds open. Make me transparent to your cross. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be holy and acceptable in your sight, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. As I was trying to prepare this week for this sermon, I was revisiting a lot of the thoughts that I had about this passage before. And I find that myself and most others who preach this passage preach about, the call of Nathanael and Philip to serve God. And the other night I was watching a documentary on PBS about Brazil, and particularly Buenos Aires. And as I was watching, the whole message of that documentary was on prejudice and how the prejudice of the poor and the rich and where you live in the city not only makes a difference, it makes a difference in whether you live or die. They have the same problem we have in so many of our cities, where if you live in the wrong spot, the police will kill you. And now that's turned into a full-scale war. And somebody made the interesting observation more than once that it has to do with the prejudice. There is no benefit of the doubt given. If somebody sees somebody from one place or the other, they're going to shoot. And I thought, wow. And then I reread this passage and I realized that's where Nathaniel starts from. He starts from prejudice. What good can come from Nazareth? This is a tale of prejudice. And let me first start by defining prejudice. The official definition of prejudice, I believe this one's out of Merriam-Webster, is that it is an unfavorable opinion or feeling formed beforehand or without knowledge, thought, or reason. Interesting. Without knowledge, thought, or reason. We just come to this conclusion. And the second part is any preconceived opinion or feeling, either favorable or unfavorable. In other words, it's before we know anything, it's what we think. It's the opinion we have. And it can be favorable or unfavorable. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how that then drives virtually everything else we do with the person or with whatever it is we're prejudiced about. And then the third is unreasonable feelings, opinions, or attitudes, especially of a hostile nature regarding an ethnic, racial, social, or religious, and I would add political group. And we ran smack into that this week. So prejudice, that's a good time to be talking about prejudice, I think, as we try to move forward in our lives as individuals, as a nation, as the church. Let's see what we can find out about what I think, at least, Jesus is saying about prejudice here. It's a tale of prejudice because Nathaniel says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? In other words, he's grouped all of the folks who come out of Nazareth into one idea and one set of thoughts and beliefs. The Galileans, not Nazareth is in Galilee, obviously, were viewed as being lax in their observance of Judaism. The members and the Jews thought the Galileans were lazy and, they're Jews, but they really aren't Jews. They don't spend time with the scripture. They don't try real hard to be good Jews. And so the Galileans saw that anyone who was coming out of Nazareth, or the Jews saw anyone who was coming out of Nazareth as kind of, almost Jews. And those from the area around Jerusalem thought themselves better Jews than the rest of Judea. So we have two things here. We have, if you're from Galilee, you're already viewed as a second-class citizen. But if someone from Jerusalem was thinking about you, well, they were so much better Jews than you. And so we get that to all of this too. And part of that was because Nazareth was a town of mixed nationalities. It was a crossroads town. It was a town that got a lot of travelers and trade through it. So it wasn't, it didn't think just Jewish, which in the minds of the Jews made them tainted, which made them, less Jews. Something had to be wrong with them because they knew more than just the Jewish religion. And what made it easier was Galileans had an accent. And the accent then was viewed as lacking sophistication. In other words, the fact that they didn't talk like those from Jerusalem and had this accent, well, that meant they were stupid, or they were certainly less in intellectual capacity because of their accent. And they were easily identified. And boy, do we see enough of that, huh? Someone who has an accent in the wrong spot. If it isn't the local accent, you can get branded real quick. How well we know, huh? And Galilee was part of the other part of the problem here was Galilee was rich. Galilee was rich in resources, and it was a beautiful section. It still is. And so there was some jealousy going on here that was adding to the prejudices. the other part of the problem that they had in Nazareth and in Galilee was they were physically separated from the rest of Judea by Samaria. So you have Judea, Samaria. Remember, the Jews do not like the Samaritans. And then you have the area of Galilee. And Galilee actually was its own area. It was ruled by a Herodian prince. And I can go through, if you want to go through all the history of the Maccabees and the reclaiming and who the Herodians were, we can do that at some point. But just know that the Herodians were not well loved by the rest of the Jews, and they were viewed as not just second-class citizens, but betrayers of the Jewish religion. And just an interesting note, they're still discriminated against by both the Jews and by Sunni Arabs because of the large Arab Sufi population. So it didn't get better here. So that you may still hear, can anything good come out of Nazareth? In this tale of prejudice, though, Philip starts without his prejudice. In other words, he's already been in contact with Jesus. He was open to what Jesus had to say. He was open to meeting Jesus. He didn't start off by blaming Jesus and discounting him. He listened, and he was to the point where he was excited. And he was excited about Jesus and meeting Jesus and what Jesus had to say. And so he goes to see Nathanael. And Nathanael says, well, what good can come out of Galilee? And Philip does not let Nathanael's prejudiced. He's picked up the prejudices, and Philip doesn't let Nathanael's prejudice stop him or dissuade him. And he's got something he's excited about. And there's a message there too, that being excited about a message or something can help you get past a prejudice if you really want to. But he doesn't let Nathanael dissuade him or move him away from Jesus. And what I find interesting here, and boy, it struck me, Nathanael almost lets his prejudice rob him of the experience and opportunity of knowing Jesus. I'm going to talk about that again too, but you got to wonder how many people we don't meet or get to know that we could meet or get to know if we were just open to the opportunity and didn't let our prejudices get in the way. So why should we care about prejudices? I mean, we all have them. They don't affect us much, or at least so we think. And some of our prejudices are positive. I mean, we look at folks and we say, okay, they're Christians, they got to be good, or we say, they come from this area of the country, they got to be okay. What's interesting to me is I've had more than one person comment to me that, they view the South as a place that is very hospitable and very genteel, only to find out now that's not always true. But that's okay. If you come in with the attitude that the area is hospitable, you're more likely to be treated hospitably. Or the people in New York, the other one, that's a negative view or connotation, but you got to look at your prejudices, and some of them are okay. They're positive. And they're good because prejudices save us time, energy, and trouble. We don't have to process every situation and every person every time. And our prejudices really do help us with that. They say, look, here's what you can expect. And they give us a starting point. And the reality of the situation is our prejudices help us to keep safe. I mean, if you get into a situation and your prejudices say this is not a safe place or a good place to be, you may not be right, but at least they help you to be on guard. So they help to keep us safe. And at the end of the day, why should we care? I mean, prejudices affect others who we really don't care about anyway. So why should we care about our prejudices? And I would argue that prejudices are expensive. That's why you are concerned about your prejudices. Prejudices cost us personally. In other words, how many opportunities do we not take advantage of because we're prejudiced going in, and we either shut everything down or we never engage in the first place. Prejudices are certainly expensive in terms of what they cost others. People are excluded, people aren't taken care of, people aren't talked to, people aren't given help and aid because we're prejudiced. And whether we like it or not, that's true. And prejudice, prejudices cause conflict, cause wars, and you got to wonder how many things are actually justified and how many are just really caused by prejudice, a preconceived notion that we have that we don't bother to test. And it can cause harm or damage, and it can certainly even cause people to be killed. Where do our prejudices come from? Well, they come from a perception of treatment and consequences to ourselves. In other words, as we look at the world and we see things unfolding, we have a tendency to take what we see and then apply it to everyone who looks like that, or comes from that area, or speaks that language, or talks in that way. We perceive how that group treats others, and we typically do that through one person, okay? And then we then apply it to all, and we do it from our own experience. What's that initial contact with someone? What's that first impression that we have? It prejudices everything else from there on. It also then, our experience of people over time. If every time we encounter someone who falls in that group, it's consistent, then we're prejudiced. We're going to assume that everyone in that group treats people that way, or acts that way, or does things in that manner. And our prejudices come from our own experience, and it comes from how we respond and interpret history. When we look at history, we go, well, that group has always been like that. By the way, bad word, always. That word, people, those folks have always been like that. That group has always responded that way. So, why should I expect anything different? I'm going to approach them as if they always act that way. I mean, what good can come out of Galilee? Every Galilean I've ever met has been rude and ignorant. It doesn't speak the language. It doesn't study. I mean, you see, okay. And how we respond and interpret history. Prejudices also come from our current experiences. What happened the last time I experienced someone from this group, good or bad? We have a tendency then to expect it to go that way the next time. And by the way, we don't even need to officially be in contact with them. We can just hear stories. Did you hear? We hear enough stories about people. We learn, and we create and generate our prejudices from there. And prejudices come from stereotype, or become stereotypes, I guess is a better way to put it. All this group is like that. All this group is like that. Okay. I had a neighbor who was of Arabic descent, and I stereotyped them. They were going to be mean. They're going to be, dangerous. They're going to be whatever. And come to find out, they were some pretty nice people who could do some pretty good things. Now, are folks from the Middle East, are there some? Sure. Are there some from America? Sure. And by the way, we are stereotyped in other nations. And societal norms also play out this way. What does society tell us to think and believe about any group of people? And remember that the societal norm is ain't like me, ain't right. And the more you ain't like me, the more you ain't right. And so we have a tendency to look at people who are different from us and say, what does society say about them? I mean, you go back to the 50s and you've got the wars, Roman Catholics aren't good. They're holy rollers or whatever. And you get that out of the Baptist side, and that's actually not the key. What you would get, the Holy Roller side would have come out of the Catholic side about Baptist and Protestants in general. And you get these norms that are not true, but we would treat people that way. I mean, I remember the Baptist and Roman Catholic and Protestant wars of the 50s and 60s, and how they played out. And you got to wonder how many people we didn't get to know, or what good we didn't see in people. And our prejudices have a tendency to affect us. We have a tendency to see and experience what our prejudices point us toward. In other words, whatever prejudice I have towards group, I'm more likely to look for things that prove that to be true. So, I find, I remember for years, I looked at universities and college professors, and I looked at them and said, they're arrogant, and they're just trying to fail and flunk everybody. It's not true, but I saw that for a number of years and didn't go for any higher education specific for a long time, because that was my sense, that they were arrogant, that they weren't there to help me. They were there to prove me wrong. I didn't need that. I'm not going to do that. Well, that's was my prejudice. I had experienced it, but I was prejudiced against the whole group because of that. And it takes a lot of behavior and experiences with different outcomes to change our minds and prejudices. In other words, prejudices are strong. And once we get them, we have a tendency to hold on to them. And it takes a lot of proving to prove them wrong. In other words, we're going to look for things that prove our prejudice instead of looking for the exceptions, or looking for the fact that what we did experience was the exception. That's okay. If I get a prejudice, it's the truth. And that's exactly the way things are. Well, it takes a lot of behavior and experiences with people to have, with different consequences, to change our minds and prejudices. And we see, experience, and interpret what we expect to see. In other words, we expect whatever our prejudices teach us to expect. That's what we do, even if that's not what is in fact happening. And I come back to Landis's rule number 2, which is any perception, real or imagined, is real and must be dealt with. And they are strong. Our perception and prejudice is a perception, and it's real. And we've got to deal with it. The problem with prejudice is that they're a major cause of, they're a driver of action. In other words, we will act on our prejudice, and it's a major cause of disagreement. If I'm prejudiced against someone, I'm going to look for, well, I may not look for opportunities to fight with them, but I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier to fight and argue with someone if I'm prejudiced against them. And it's a lot easier to agree with someone if I do, if I'm prejudiced that we do agree. But it's a lot easier to disagree and fight and argue and debate with someone, and not even debate, fight and argue, if I'm prejudiced against them or what they're saying. And it causes physical harm and violence. I mean, you only need to look, you don't need to look any further than Pine Bluff. And you see the harm and the violence, and you look around the country. You can see the physical harm and violence that occurs because of prejudices. And it results in the people ignoring the basic needs of those against whom they're prejudiced, and to neglect them. Be very simple. Black folks are, I'm going to go to one here. Black folks are lazy and they don't want to work. So, that's their problem. Or, poor folks are they're poor because of their own cause. And so we're going to discriminate. We're going to deprive. We're not going to take care of their basic needs. And by the way, if they have, prejudice says if they're poor because they caused that poor. Really, I've known some folks who aren't. And I will tell you, on the other side of this pandemic, when we get there, we're going to find a lot of folks who, how do I say this, don't deserve the outcome that they've had. They were working hard. They got it taken away from them, and now they find themselves in a big problem. But we're prejudiced. They're poor. They must have done something. Prejudice really results in dehumanization, which, in other words, we stop looking at we start looking at people as a tag, as a label instead of as human beings, and that results in the ignoring and the devaluing of their ideas. In other words, what they have to say doesn't matter. What can they know? And they can't be talented, you know, or can't make a contribution to society. And what's been interesting to me is if you go on Facebook, it'll only take you about a minute to find some memes, or not memes, to find some little tags that will show you the difference. People who are poor, people who you would look at and go, what can they know? They're poor. They can't have the talent. Who turn us very quickly to find out we're wrong. I mean, how many times, I don't know, I don't watch Does America Have Talent or America's Got Talent or any of those shows, but you know, if you watch any of them, you oftentimes find that what you prejudged, you know, that young girl can't have a voice, that young man can't play an instrument or dance or whatever, you find yourself really wrong. Susan Boyle is a classic example. Many of you would know who that was. Here we have I'm being mean here, but we have a woman that's less than attractive and overweight. And so how could she have a beautiful singing voice that could bring meaning to a song? Well, we found out how wrong we were about that. And that was pretty much the case of what we found with her. We also dehumanize people, and we don't give them support. We also don't give them voice. We don't listen to them. And whatever you feel about Black Lives Matter, what they're trying to get, and I don't necessarily always agree with their method, but what they're trying to get is voice. And they're saying we do not have voice, and it's because we're prejudiced against. I think we need at least to listen to that and say, okay, what can we do about this, and how true is it? A discrimination application of dual standards, I don't need to tell you, you can see. And our temptation is to walk by them. This poor person is begging, and so they must have done something wrong, and we go by them. And we find real quick the dehumanization. It's easy to hate somebody that we don't perceive as human. And you know, you don't need to go too far to go back and just read the comments and the accounts of what happened on Wednesday to see what dehumanization does. And then that lends to a tendency and an intention to want to do harm. That came to clarity this week. And it's easier, and we can be more willing to hurt people if we don't view them as human. They're not human. And I told you my story of my friend in seminary who was this gentle person who was a really good marksman in Vietnam. And he said the only way he got good at that was by dehumanizing the people on dehumanizing what were people on the other end of his gun sights. He very quickly turned them into something other than human, and therefore it was easy to kill them. And we also have a desire to eliminate those against whom we have prejudice. And that's at its worst, what we've seen over the past week raise its ugly head. And I don't think it's gone away yet. I think we may find ourselves in the middle of fighting some things that we probably hoped we didn't. Certainly, you know, you need only look at Germany in the 30s and early 40s to see what that does. How easy when you dehumanize an entire group of people, and not just Germany. I mean, we find this in all of the ethnic cleansings. We have a desire; those folks have a desire to eliminate those against whom they have prejudice, because they've dehumanized them. What does passage tell us to do when we encounter prejudice? Well, Philip doesn't tell Nathanael he's wrong, because the first thing Nathanael would have done was throw the switch and not listen to anything else Philip had to say. But Philip doesn't tell Nathanael he's wrong. He says, well, tell you what, why don't you come? You make the decision, but come with me. Come see, experience this Jesus of Nazareth from Galilee. See what you think after you experience him. The unspoken is keep an open mind, but he invites Nathanael to have the experience. And then the other thing is, we have a tendency when we get a sense that someone's prejudiced against us, or when we have prejudice, that we don't approach him in neutral. And Jesus finds something positive about Nathanael. He watches him, he sees them, he observes them, and he says, yeah, there's somebody that's got integrity. There is no deceit in this man. And he says that to Nathanael. And Nathanael goes, whoa, where'd that come from? But Jesus tells him the truth. He doesn't try to inflate it. Boy, are you a great guy, man. You are this absolutely perfect man. Jesus just says, you know what? You don't lie. You have integrity. And he doesn't try to inflate it or make it up, but he lays out for him the positive that he sees. And maybe that'd be a way, at least for many of us, to start off a little better. How do you change the mindset of prejudices other? Well, I think you've got to invite them to experience what you experience. Catch them doing something right. Don't start by telling them doing something wrong. That's what we saw. And we embrace and support messages, however, that are consistent with our prejudices and experience. So I guess what I'm saying here is, don't try to immediately turn someone's prejudice or what they're thinking. Invite them to experience something different and have the strength and courage to maybe experience something different from what they had experienced, which might change their minds. Consistent messages change mindsets of prejudices, but it can't be words. Words change nothing unless there is supporting behavior behind that. And it's got to be a consistent behavior over a period of time, contrary to the behavior of the prejudice would expect. In other words, two things here. Words change nothing. That's why I've seen it on more than once on the social media, where people say, look, you can post all you want here. You're not going to change any minds here just by posting on social media. You've got to support it with your behavior. And I think that's true. I think we got to pay attention to that. And I think we got to look at that. And I think we got to be careful that what we say and what we do, well, what we say and what we do are not in harmony. People listen to what we do. And so we've got to, and prejudices have already started us at a different level. So now we've got to make up that deficit and then move ahead of that. And that's an important piece to realize too, that when you're dealing with a prejudice, you're not dealing with equal footing. You're starting at a deficit if you're trying to overcome that prejudice. And then the only thing it does is consistent behavior that's contrary to the prejudice. In other words, if you're prejudiced against someone, they've got to act a lot over a period of time consistently in a way that's different from what your prejudice expects, if they're going to change that prejudice. So how do we combat our prejudices? Well, I think the first thing you got to do is name them. It's not fun, but you got to inventory your prejudices. I try to do that on a pretty consistent basis. Name and identify my prejudices. At least then I know by what I am being affected. At least when I inventory my prejudices, I know what's impacting my decisions and my thinking. And then I can at least take a look at them and go, where did this come from? Is it a valid source? Has that source changed? What has changed? Is it still consistent? Do I still feel that way? And what has been the consequences of me holding on to that prejudice? I think that's important if we're going to evaluate our prejudices. In other words, because I have this prejudice and I act on it, what's happened because of it? Good things, bad things? That's an important thing to take a look at. You got to be open to new experiences too. And you got to take actions that challenge your prejudices. Don't let your prejudices define you. My mom grew up in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and she grew up deeply ingrained with the prejudices that came from that in the 40s and 50s. And she was very, very much a racist. And you should have seen her face. Well, so, and my father was as well, even though he came from the North, he was as well, just slightly different. And they both ingrained in me that black is bad, black is wrong, black is stupid, black is, anything you want to say in a negative way. That was ingrained in me. And then I got to college. When I got to college, I had a black roommate. It was shocking for me, but I had no choice. And I realized, no, John, you know what? You are prejudiced here. Why don't you? And I had no choice but to experience Rob. And I remember clearly that it only took, about two weeks of living with him in the same room to realize, you know what? He's a pretty good guy. And the things I've been told and about Black people may not be the case. And Rob was just one of those great guys. The thing that was surprising to me was I came to care for Rob, and let me tell you how bad the prejudice my mother had was. She could not sit and eat with a Black person without being physically nauseated. She would get physically sick. Well, being a college student who wanted to rub people's nose and everything, I brought Rob home for dinner for the weekend one time. And what was interesting was by the end of the weekend, my mom started off, she couldn't eat with him, barely be in the same room with him. By the time we finished the weekend, Mom was eating with him to the point where when I got married, she invited Rob to sit at her table for the wedding and smiled and laughed and had a good time the whole time. But she was willing to work through her prejudices. And she got to know Rob, and she got to know, she got to experience a really good person because she was willing to challenge her prejudice. I think we've got to remove ourselves from others who hold on to and act out their prejudices at the expense of everything. In other words, they will not even consider that there could be something else. And particularly when they're trying to change you, you can challenge their prejudices, but most of the time you won't get to that. Get to know somebody who embodies your negative stereotype. Like I said, I got to know Rob real well, and he changed my mind. So what do we learn from all this? First of all, prejudices can be very damaging and destructive. And if we want to change our prejudice, ours or others, our prejudices or other people's, it takes time and intentional work to do that. And I guess if you get nothing else out of this sermon, please do not devalue any human. We are all children of God. We've all been made by God in God's image. Don't believe me? Look at Genesis 1:27. Do not devalue human beings. God doesn't. Are you really willing to get in God's face and say, no, God, you're wrong. What you created was a bad thing or a bad person? Well, you can if you want to, but I'm not going to. So what good can come from our prejudices? Well, it depends. If we allow our unexamined prejudices to guide us and our actions, well, no good is going to come from them. But if we learn from Jesus and follow his example, the experience of the kingdom of heaven comes closer to us until we can go there. So maybe if we look at our prejudices and work through them and learn to treat people differently and not treat them as we are prejudiced to, we might get a little closer to the kingdom of heaven while we're still here. You see, I'm prejudiced. I'm prejudiced to believe that the consequences of learning and doing what Jesus wants us to do is a good thing. And the consequences are something that I really do want to have happen if I do what Jesus calls me, shows me, teaches me to do. But don't let me prejudice you. You decide what good can come from managing your present prejudices.